June 4, 1942. The waters of the Pacific stretched vast and silent, a stage set for one of the most decisive encounters in naval history. On the Japanese side, Admiral Yamamoto believed his plan was flawless. He had lured the Americans into what he thought was a trap, Midway Island, the tiny atoll that he expected would draw out the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet for annihilation. To his admirals, Yamamoto's confidence seemed unshakable. Japan's carrier strike force, led by 4 of its most powerful flat-tops, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, appeared unstoppable, backed by the proud pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. What Yamamoto did not know, what no Japanese officer suspected, was that the Americans already held the script to his grand play. In a darkened room thousands of miles away, codebreakers at Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo had torn open Japan's most guarded naval ciphers. They had read the orders, understood the timing, and mapped out the trap long before the first Japanese aircraft roared into the skies. Yamamoto thought he was the hunter. In truth, his fleet was sailing blind, straight into the crosshairs of an enemy who knew his every move. At Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo, a team of young cryptanalysts had spent sleepless nights bent over intercepted transmissions. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a quiet man in a bathrobe and slippers, who understood that the key to victory lay not in firepower, but in information. The Japanese Navy relied on its JN-25 code, a complex system of numbers and additives believed unbreakable. Yet, piece by piece, Rochefort's team unraveled its secrets. They discovered repeated patterns, predictable phrases, and careless operators who left small windows into a supposedly closed fortress. By late May, the Americans were certain. AF, the code word in Japanese messages, meant Midway. To prove it, they devised a ruse. Midway's garrison sent an unencrypted radio message complaining of a water shortage. Within hours, Japanese signals confirmed that AF lacked fresh water. The trap was sprung not at Midway, but against Japan itself. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in silence. What the Japanese thought would be a surprise assault was already compromised, every movement shadowed by invisible eyes. The decisive battle was no longer about chance encounters at sea. It had become a duel shaped by intelligence. Dawn broke over Midway with a crimson glow on June 4th. From the decks of Japanese carriers, pilots clambered into cockpits, convinced they were striking an unsuspecting outpost. Their bombs fell hard upon the atoll, tearing through runways and installations, but the defenders clung on. What the Japanese aircrews did not know was that American eyes were already fixed on their carriers, lurking beyond the horizon. Nimitz's intelligence had given his commanders the priceless advantage of position. Spruance and Fletcher, leading the U.S. carriers, held their planes back until the enemy's decks were crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft, an accident of timing that would prove catastrophic. Yet the battle did not begin with precision. Early waves of American torpedo squadrons launched desperate attacks, hurtling low over the waves. Nearly every plane was shot down in fire and steel, their sacrifice seeming in vain. But those doomed runs dragged Japanese fighters out of formation and left the skies open. Then, like a blade striking at the perfect moment, U.S. dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown plummeted through the clouds. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into raging infernos, their decks consumed by fire, their fate sealed. The Pacific shook with the thunder of explosions as smoke rose in towering columns from the Japanese carriers. Sailors fought in vain to contain the infernos, but aviation fuel and armed bombs turned each vessel into a floating death trap. Amid the chaos, Admiral Nagumo tried to salvage his force, rallying what remained of his fleet. Only Hiryu, still untouched, struck back. Her pilots roared across the sea, diving upon Yorktown with fierce precision. Explosions tore into the American carrier, leaving her crippled and burning. For a moment, it seemed the balance might tip. Yet fate had already chosen its course. American scouts found Hiryu, her decks lined with planes preparing for another strike. Dive bombers from Enterprise descended like hawks, their bombs smashing into her decks, igniting a final firestorm. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers lay sinking or abandoned, their proud air wings lost to the sea. Yamamoto, far to the west, received the grim reports in disbelief. His masterstroke had unraveled in a single day, undone not by luck, but by the unseen work of codebreakers and the daring of young aviators. Midway was no longer a stepping stone to Hawaii. It had become the graveyard of Japan's naval supremacy. When the sun rose the next morning, the calm Pacific belied the scale of what had unfolded. 4 Japanese carriers, once symbols of empire, now rested beneath the waves. Over 300 aircraft were gone, along with irreplaceable crews who had spearheaded victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. For the Japanese Navy, Midway marked a wound that would never heal. The momentum of conquest had been broken, their aura of invincibility shattered. In contrast, for the United States, the battle became a turning point. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and even the battered Yorktown had proven that courage, guided by intelligence, could rewrite the balance of power. Yet behind the glory of the pilots stood the quiet triumph of the cryptanalysts. In cramped rooms filled with paper slips, typewriters, and endless radio intercepts, they had deciphered Japan's intentions with relentless precision. Without their work, Midway might have been America's downfall instead of Japan's catastrophe. The story of Midway is not only about bombs and torpedoes, but about minds that unlocked the enemy's secrets. Yamamoto sought to crush the American fleet in one decisive blow. Instead, his carriers sank into the abyss, and with them, the dream of Japanese domination slipped forever out of reach.